We all know about hippies. The influence they have on our society can be seen everywhere. From rock and roll to flower power. TV and movies often portray hippies as fun, quirky characters with dirty feet, who love meditation, Eastern music, who love drugs such as weed, shrooms and LSD. Hippies culture no doubt had an everlasting effect on society as we know it, and in countries all around the world.
Hey man, I hate you all, give me money, hey man, oh man.
What exactly was the hippie movement? Where did they come from? What were they about? And why did they disappear? Let's try and answer these questions and more. But before we get to hippies, we need to take a trip all the way back to the 16th of November, 1938, to Sandoz Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland. It was here that the Swiss chemist, Albert Hofmann, first synthesized a chemical called lysergic acid diethylamide, more commonly known as LSD. Now I'm sure many of us have heard of LSD, but how many people today actually know what it is, what it does, and why it's illegal? In my part of the world, not many. The only exposure to LSD we have is what we see in movies and TV. In fact, I have only ever come across it once in my lifetime, and not until I was in my 30s and never again. There's a reason it's almost impossible to find these days, but more on that later. Back to the story. LSD was synthesized as part of a group of research chemicals while searching for medicinal compounds in ergot, a poisonous fungus that grows on rye kernels. These chemicals were created with the intention of finding medications for diseases like depression, ADHD, or as a stimulant for people suffering from respiratory issues. Most of the synthesized chemicals, including LSD, were initially thought to be useless and shelved. It wasn't until 5 years later that he accidentally absorbed a small amount of the drug and discovered its powerful effects. While working with the synthesized acid, Hofmann accidentally touched his face. He soon felt strange and began hallucinating. In his memoir he recounted the scene. As I lay in a dazed condition with my eyes closed, there surged upon me an uninterrupted stream of fantastic images of extraordinary plasticity and vividness, and accompanied by an intense, kaleidoscope-like play of colors. 3 days later, on the 19th of April, 1943, he decided to experiment on himself. This time, he ingested 0.25 milligrams, 250 micrograms, of liquid LSD. More than an hour passed until Hofmann experienced gradual changes in his perception. Unsure of what would happen next, he asked his laboratory assistant to escort him home. As was customary in 1943, they made the journey by bicycle. On the way, Hofmann was suddenly overcome with anxiety and paranoia, and he suddenly became convinced that his next-door neighbor was a malevolent witch. He thought he was going insane, and was convinced that the LSD had poisoned him. A doctor was called to examine him, and when the house doctor arrived, however, he couldn't find anything wrong with Hofmann except that his pupils were widely dilated. Hofmann was reassured that he'd be fine, and soon his fear began to give way to a sense of enjoyment. He recorded his reactions in his journal. I was seized by the dreadful fear of going insane, he wrote. I was taken to another world, another place, another time. My body seemed to be without sensation, lifeless, strange. Was I dying? Was this the transition? At times I believed myself to be outside my body, and then perceived clearly, as an outside observer, the complete tragedy of my situation. Hofmann had just become the first person to take purified LSD. When he woke up the next morning, he was astonished to find no lingering effects, and he was convinced that LSD would find practical use in psychiatry and neurology. After more intensive testing, LSD was finally released commercially in 1947 for psychiatric use under the trade name Delicid. Hoffman continued to take it in small doses for the rest of his life. He never gave up on finding more uses for LSD. Now, consider that all this played out during World War II. A lot of the original hippies were born nearing the end, or directly after the war. How does war affect children? Well, this is complicated because not all children experience war in the same way. While some might be directly inside the conflict zone and experience horrific abuses and human rights violations, some might be evacuated to more peaceful areas, be forced to live with relatives or foster parents, and some might even be recruited to take part directly in war efforts. For example, like the Hitler Youths, who were instructed to take up arms and fight to the death after most of their male parents were killed or had surrendered to the invading Allied forces. Numerous American soldiers recall how they were shot at by little boys and had to choose whether to return fire or to try and disarm them without killing them. This would obviously be dependent on the situation, but now I've tried to find a word or phrase that I could use here to indicate the following. What is a word for an event or a moment that affects you so deeply that changes you completely to the point where you question everything that you have believed in your whole life? This must have been one of those moments, which, no doubt, there was no shortage of in and around this time period. For instance, on the 1st of September, 1939, which was 2 days before England entered the Second World War, they expected massive bombings of their main towns and cities, and many children were evacuated to rural areas. It was the largest movement of people ever seen in Britain, with most of them traveling with their schools, by train, and went to live with volunteer foster parents in the countryside. These country folks were often shocked by the lack of hygiene and poor diets of inner-city children, and some town children were just as shocked to have found themselves living in isolated, primitive farming communities with no electricity or running water. This era was known as the phony war because, for months, nothing happened. Like when COVID first started, and we all wore masks and waited for people to start dropping dead all around us, but then nothing happened. Fake news, right? Because no one died. Yeah, until they did. So, kinda like that. A few weeks after the evacuation, a steady stream of children started to arrive back in the cities, at train stations, ready to go back home. Unfortunately, many arrived back to empty homes after their parents either fled or joined the army. And this constant stream of children returning continued for almost a year, until the following September in 1940, when the Germans did start to drop bombs on London, which then led to another wave of evacuations. This time thousands of kids were evacuated to countries like America, New Zealand, Australia and South Africa. It's also important to note that not all kids were evacuated. During the first wave, only 47% of kids were sent away. Most parents simply refused to part ways with their young children. Children who stayed in the cities would suffer all the perils of war, such as bombing raids, shortages of basic necessities like food, water, clothing, and the lack of basic public facilities like firefighters, police, postal and health services. Now this section was supposed to be just a few lines, but I just found it so interesting, because I've never heard these stories before. So please bear with me. I just felt that it needed to be told. There are still forums on the internet today, with survivors and evacuees from this era looking to reach out to their peers. Now during the Blitz, the German bombardment of London, some of these lost children organized themselves into rescue teams, who took it upon themselves to put out fires and rescue survivors from buildings that were destroyed by German bombers. This was very dangerous work, and sadly, many kids died doing this. Overall, it's been confirmed that around 10% of bombing victims were, in fact, children. In total, between 2.5 and 3.5 million children, about twice the population of Nebraska, were evacuated from Britain, and after the war, most of them returned to towns that were devastated by repeat bombings, to families they no longer recognized, to missing or dead family members, or to families who no longer wanted them. That's not even taking into account the trauma these kids endured from separation, confusion, and anxiety of not knowing what's going to happen to them in future. It's safe to say that it wasn't as simple as just going back to normal. And so far, this is only the account of children in England, where exceptional records were kept, which is why we know of the accounts of these brave children. Imagine what it must have been like for the children in France and Germany, where all the infrastructure laid in ruins and needed to be rebuilt. Russia alone lost 20 million of its most productive people during the war. Large parts of Africa were in ruins. And Asia had just witnessed Japanese citizens take 2 atom bombs. Obviously, some of the worst damage suffered were from those who survived the concentration camps, and their stories were shared by the survivors who moved to countries all around the world. Television had become a household item by this time, and the horrors of the concentration camps were broadcast worldwide during the Nuremberg trials in 1946. 4 years after, the headlines of newspapers would read about escaped Nazis, hunted down by the famous Nazi hunter, Simon Wiesenthal, keeping the atrocities fresh in the minds of the public at large. Even America did not escape unscathed from the war. Firstly, they had to face the fact that they had locked up many of their own citizens in concentration camps. Because Japan had declared war on America during World War II, with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, all American citizens of Japanese descent were under suspicion of being loyal to Japan, so they were placed into camps. Their homes, their possessions, everything they owned, were taken from them. After the war, they basically had to rebuild their lives from nothing. America also had to deal with the military losses, and the troops that returned were obviously not the same when they returned. But back then they also actually cared about their war veterans. Their soldiers were given housing benefits, a pension, and even paid for them to go to college or university. I think what history fails to teach us is how war and prolonged conflict affects society, and the younger you are, the more profound its effects. It's well known that even pregnant mothers exposed to trauma will give birth to babies who could suffer from long-term psychological damage to their well-being later in life. Psychiatry has also long since rubbished the idea that children between age 2 and 5 are too young to be traumatized because they, 1, either don't understand what's happening, or 2, are too young to remember. Although sadly, many parents are still in denial of this. But it is this period in a child's life that is most important in developing a child's character and personality. Children may not understand every situation, but they are very well attuned to their environment and can pick up when things aren't right. Even being exposed to news reports about war and possible conflict is enough to create an environment of fear, anxiety, and uncertainty. And, for Americans, what followed directly after was the Cold War, where schools had safety drills for what to do in the event of a nuclear attack from the Russians. It was this period where many Americans were so sure of nuclear war that they started building bomb shelters and underground bunkers on a massive scale. So, what are the effects of childhood trauma? As children's brains develop, they are learning how safe or unsafe the world is through their experiences, says psychotherapist Yolanda Renteria from verywellmind.com. A child has to develop a way to protect itself from what it deems unsafe. The ways in which a child protects itself shape their adult personality. Childhood trauma can lead to feelings of anxiety, fear, and panic attacks in later life. Specific symptoms may include hypervigilance. This is characterized by not being able to let your guard down, always being on high alert, and expecting the worst to happen at any time. It can also be called being jumpy. Another symptom, which is oddly specific, is being a people pleaser. This means not being able to say no to people, or not being able to set boundaries. For example, when a friend asks to borrow some cash, you can't really afford to but you feel obligated to. Or you'll work yourself to the bone for a company that doesn't appreciate it, and when you are asked to work overtime, without notice, you do so without complaint. Another symptom is judging people to be either good or bad. Where most people can admire and befriend people who gossip, bully, steal, cheat, lie, etc. For you there is no middle ground. People are either good, or they are bad. Another symptom is always being in a rush to get things done, and yet having no long-term life goals. A classic symptom associated with the hippie lifestyle, but we are getting ahead of ourselves here. Trauma can also lead to an intense fear of being placed on the spot, like being called on to speak in class, or during a meeting. Some people can end up becoming withdrawn, with great feelings of shame and having a need to sort of blend into the background without drawing attention to yourself. But others might become more aggressive, feeling a need to dominate over others in an attempt to gain back control over their environment. These symptoms can stem from trauma that you might not even think affected you at the time. Many kids of this generation, the baby boomers, were born into a world of paranoia and fear, and while psychology was already a well-established science, there was heavy stigma placed on those who sought to see a therapist. So instead, many people either kept their feelings bottled up inside while others sought out spiritual and emotional guidance from so-called gurus and cult leaders, but we'll get to that later. After the war, the whole world was sick of war, and obviously marred by trauma and survivor's guilt, and television brought with it a glimpse into the lives of people from around the world, and from cultures they had never seen before. In 1947, the Roswell incident made headlines, bringing with it a fear and fascination with UFOs, with many people hoping that an advanced alien race would save humanity from itself. This may seem insignificant, but UFOs brought with it a feeling of solidarity among the whole human race, even if just for a split second. Also in 1947, LSD was introduced as a commercial medication under the trade name Delicid for various psychiatric uses. LSD was brought to the attention of the United States in 1949 by Sandoz Laboratories. Throughout the 1950s, mainstream media reported on research into LSD and its growing use in psychiatry, and undergraduate psychology students began taking LSD as part of their education and described the effects of the drug to their friends. Time magazine published 6 positive reports on LSD between 1954 and 1959. In one study in the late 1950s, Humphrey Osmond gave LSD to alcoholics in the Alcoholics Anonymous program who had previously failed to quit drinking. After 1 year, around 50% of the study group had not had a single drink, a success rate that has never been seen before from any other treatment. Also, it was around this time that the CIA had heard about North Korea administering a so-called truth serum to American prisoners of war. So, the CIA shipped large amounts of LSD to the US for use in secret government-sponsored studies involving mind control and truth serums as part of Operation MKUltra, where secret government agencies secretly drugged many private citizens to study its effects on the mind and to see if they could reprogram human beings. This turned out to be a massive waste of time and money. Around this time, LSD use skyrocketed in the USA, and by the 1950s, a new cultural and literary movement began to take off on universities and colleges all over America. The Beat Generation. Unlike hippies, the Beat Generation and later the Beatniks were never really large in their numbers. They were a select group of scholars, professors, writers and poets, and they were highly educated in various fields of academia. The founders of the Beat Generation met at Columbia University in the early 1940s. Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. Their works greatly influenced American culture and American politics. They were against consumer culture, materialism, and various ideologies which were accepted as part of American culture like white nationalism, racism, sexism, and conservatism, and so on. They also experimented with psychedelic drugs and sexual exploration. In a time of much prejudice, they had women members and African American writers ready to tell their stories. Writers of the Beat generation were heavily influenced by jazz artists like Billie Holiday, and their poetry was often told accompanied by jazz music.
It's the beat generation, it's Bayat, it's the beat to keep, it's the beat of the heart. It's being beat and down in the world and like old time low down. And like in ancient civilizations, the slave boatmen rowing galleys to a beat, and servants spinning pottery to a beat.
These were the guys usually dressed in iconic, all-black clothing, black hat, with black shades and some bongos. The original Men in Black. They essentially invented the spoken word album, a precursor to rap. It was around this time that there was a large influx of foreigners from all over the world to countries like England and America, which brought with them a fascination of Eastern culture and mysticism. This was also the time when Bruce Lee brought with him an interest in martial arts teachings. Remember, karate was not about violence, but rather focused on discipline and self-defense. Lessons like using your opponent's energy against them, breathing techniques, and developing mind and body. All about find your inner peace, and so forth. Concepts like yin and yang, kai, feng shui, meditation and spirituality burst onto the scene. With the writings of the Beats gaining popularity in the 50s, long-held cultural beliefs were brought into question and re-evaluated. Before, you could never have asked your parents questions about topics like puberty and sex, or questions regarding religion, morality, political views, and blind devotion to governments. You would likely get your ass beat and told not to question your elders. But now, suddenly everything was open to scrutiny and intellectual discussion. In all my research, I can't find the exact moment in time where hippie culture was invented or who the first hippies were. There is no origin story or founders of the hippie culture movement. As far as I can tell, hippie lifestyle and hippie culture was the natural evolution from young people's need to find a place for themselves in the new world. They were part of a modern, progressive generation born into a primitive world that was advancing technologically and at an astounding rate, run by old people with outdated ideologies and beliefs. At the time, they didn't know what they were searching for. All they knew was that they did not believe in the accepted narrative, and that they did not like where society was headed. They were against the expanding consumer culture, and were in favor of a more holistic approach to life, more in tune with Mother Nature. Some of the more widespread beliefs of the hippies were that commercialism, materialism, and industrialism were leading to the destruction of the natural world. In fact, it was hippie movement that led to the Environmental Protection Initiative gaining widespread acceptance by the general public. Which is where the term flower children come from. They were also often called tree huggers. The term hippie was derived from hipster, which was slang for someone considered cool in the mid-60s. By 1964, fashion sense started to drift towards the hippie look, but upon closer inspection, in my opinion, the designs seemed to be inspired by Native American culture. In 1965, LSD use exploded among young people. You can see its effects influencing the designs and fashion of young people, and by 1966 psychedelic designs can be spotted everywhere, and in 1967 the first mention of hippies starts to appear in various news media of the time, and it was actually used as a pejorative, as in, you dirty hippies. Many adopted a vegetarian lifestyle, and they made their own clothing. The psychedelic clothing from the late 1960s were made by hippies themselves, which was then later copied by commercial and fashion industries. They also practiced what was known as free love, which came to imply a sexually active lifestyle without getting married, with casual sex partners and little or no commitment. Many males grew beards, and both men and women wore sandals and beads. Women wore long flowing so-called granny dresses. Rimless granny glasses were popular with both men and women. There were actually a number of counterculture movements during that time. But to be a hippie, they didn't have a strict membership procedure like, for instance, you can't be part of a motorcycle gang without the bike, the leather, the attitude, biker boots and so on. Hippies didn't actively try to distance themselves from anyone who wanted to take part in hippie culture. They didn't discriminate or call anyone a fake hippie. Not once have I ever come across a case of hippie exclusion. With most subcultures of the time, except for, maybe the misfits, you had to make an effort. To name a few, there were jocks, nerds, rock and rollers, skateboarder, roller skaters, greasers, cowboys, surfers, and later we had goth, hacker, gamers, rasta, steampunk, lolita and skinheads. I just found out that the original British skinheads weren't racists and had nothing to do with politics and white supremacy. Hippies embraced everyone and welcomed all. Their goal was to spread love and peace to everyone. No one was ever bullied for not being hippie enough, although there were levels. For example, you could be a casual hippie, have a job or go to school and wear flower pattern dresses, and bright hippie colors, and have a love for hippie culture, the flower child. Then there were those who left their homes and got more into the drug and free love aspects of hippie culture. Then there were those deeply committed to the lifestyle. They chose to completely drop out of consumer culture and modern living, and many created hippie communes, practiced vegetarianism, free love. They never shaved or sometimes never bathed. A lot of them even chose to live completely cash-free by growing their own food. Now, to understand the movement, we need to get into the mindset of the average American of the time. Although the hippie movement was not directly involved in political protests, it was influenced by the broader social and political climate of the time. The anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, and the women's liberation movement all had an impact on the development of hippie culture. We last left off in the late 50s with the Beats, so we'll continue from there. When Elvis Presley's career was at its peak, he had teenagers, and specifically teenage girls, going mental at his live shows. These days girls screaming at a concert is not unusual, but back in 1956 and 1957 no one had ever seen anything like it, and this confused the adults of the time, and many of the grown-ups were so scared that they wanted Elvis to be thrown in jail. When teenage girls watched Elvis dancing, that was when the screaming started. The older generation saw this as unnatural and called Elvis a sexual pervert. Even psychologists feared that teenage girls and boys could easily be, quote, aroused to sexual indulgence and perversion by certain types of dance moves and hysteria. Analysts even go as far as to say that Elvis Presley brought sex to the minds of teenage girls in the 50s. Before the 50s, teenagers didn't have famous musicians that they idealized like we have these days, and although records were available long before then, they were very brittle and would break easily because they were made of clay, cotton and shellac, a resin secreted by insects. Also, the records were very expensive, so they were mostly made for adults. A quick history of plastics here. It won't take long, I promise. Plastic was invented in 1907, but like any technology, it was slow to be adopted on a wide scale. It was mostly used for manufacturing cars and airplanes up until World War II. When shortages developed for things like tents, parachutes, warm clothing, women gave up various luxury items, and even donated things like wool and stockings to make parachutes and uniforms for the war. Kitchens this time had only steel, for example, like those old-timey biscuit tins Grandma used to have. Women were used to those and didn't want to change them for plastic at first, but in 1948 Tupperware hit the market and the plastic industry slowly took off, replacing many things around the house with plastic. And when PVC was first used to make records in 1948, music became cheaper over time. Plastic records lasted longer and didn't break as easily, so kids and teenagers had more access to them. So, the timing was perfect for rock and roll artists like Elvis, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, Little Richard.
Little Richard, I love Little Richard. Little Richard, you are the innovator, the motivator, you are a creator. You started it all. You the first Little. What we got now? Lil Bow Wow. Lil Wayne. Lil Zane. Lil Kim. That's your name, man.
Since it was music for a younger generation. Teens would see artists perform live on television, and could buy the records in stores. Back then everything on TV had to be performed live. Color TV was invented in 1953, but it would take another 10 years for it to be mass-produced for the public. Color film was already in use in cinema though, but was too expensive for common people. The war also normalized the idea of women working, so cash flow wasn't as tightly controlled by the man of the house anymore. Teenagers, both male and female, could now get jobs at places like drive-through fast food restaurants called diners. McDonald's was already 10 years old in 1950. So, they were the popular hangout spot for teenagers, and you could play a song on the jukebox for 10 cents. If you wanted to be cool, Daddy-O, you would play a song for everyone to listen to, and girls would thank you if you played their favorite song. Meanwhile, the college kids would indulge in books and poetry published by the Beats, who also released a few records. The core message of beat culture was rejecting the traditions and values of the previous generation. They wanted an identity of their own and rejected the idea of getting married, with 2.4 kids, getting a desk job, working 9 hours a day, until you retire, or what they called being a square. Instead, they sought out a meaning to life, with a deep exploration of Eastern religion and philosophy. William Clifford Brown, who went by the name Big Brown, was an African-American street poet, performer, and recording artist, and a prominent member of the Beats during the 1950s in New York. It was his poetry that would start the evolution to rap and hip-hop. Now before we get to the 60s, I didn't know exactly how to bring in the story of the Owsley Stanley, also called the Bear. That's because his story and influence is so constant and overbearing to the story. Like Albert Hofmann before him, his influence on 60s counterculture cannot be overstated. Without him the 60s would probably not have been the 60s, and his contribution to the story spans all the way from late 50s all through the 1960s. There's no way I could do it proper justice, so I'll give you this quote from Robert Greenfield, who wrote a book about him. The insane genius of this human being was that he was like a rebel without a cause. He never fit and was a complete outsider. He was brilliant at everything. He'd been in the Air Force. He worked as a rocket engineer. At the same time, he was really kind of a lost soul, and didn't have a place to find himself. Then somebody gave him a half a dose of pure Sandoz acid. Remember Sandoz from the beginning? Yeah, that one. And it was beyond anything he'd ever taken before. At the time, he was taking classes at the University of California, Berkeley, and after his LSD experience, he went to the Bancroft Library and spent a couple weeks reading all the existing literature on LSD. Then he began to manufacture acid, synthesizing the purest LSD to ever hit the street. Albert Hofmann, who first synthesized LSD in 1938 and took the first intentional acid trip in history, supposedly once said Owsley was the only one who ever got the crystallization process right. It is incredibly difficult to make LSD. It's not like Walter White cooking meth. It's a very, very difficult chemical process, and Owsley was so obsessive that the glassware he used when he made the acid was designed especially for him. The acid he created was so powerful, clean, and pure that he became the supplier to Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. Interviewer: I followed the Graceful Dead and knew about Bear and his legend, but to those not in the know, why was Bear one of the most important figures in the rise of 1960s counterculture? It was Bear's acid that helped create what was going on at all these iconic countercultural events. When Bear heard the Grateful Dead perform for the first time in 1966, he knew they were going to be bigger than the Beatles. He became their sound guy, their benefactor, and he paid to take them to Los Angeles to be a part of Kesey's acid tests. Most of the people who were at the Human Being concert were tripping on a brand new batch of acid he created called White Lightning. The first batch he ever created consisted of 800,000 doses, an extraordinary amount. At the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival, there was another new batch he created called Monterey Purple. He gave his acid to Pete Townsend of The Who had taken LSD before, but nothing like what Bear gave him. Townsend said the stuff was so powerful that he didn't take acid again for 18 years. John Lennon also sent a cameraman to Monterey with the express purpose of bringing back enough Owsley acid to last him a lifetime. Lennon was terrified he wasn't going to have enough acid for the rest of his life, and he only wanted to take Owsley's acid, which Bear gave him packed in a lens case. The Beatles then tripped for the next 3 weeks, and it led to the creation of the Magical Mystery Tour album and the movie. A couple nights later in San Francisco at Fillmore West, he gave Jimi Hendrix the acid, too. He was one of the guys who actually created the 60s. Without his LSD, I don't think those times would have been as crazy as they were, and that's why I decided to write the book. Now keep this in mind as we go through the 60s. It's no coincidence that the 60s is well known for vibrant colors, psychedelic designs, neon-colored beanbags and trippy wallpaper. All a direct influence of psychedelic drugs, which were still completely legal. The Beatles, who were associated with the Beatniks, started their musical careers in England, Liverpool in 1960. They are widely regarded as one of the most influential bands in the history of popular music. The Beatles' music and style had a significant impact on the hippie movement, and they were embraced by many young people as symbols of the counterculture. The Beatles' music was often associated with the use of psychedelic drugs, and their lyrics often contained references to drug use and LSD. In 1960, Professor Timothy Leary founded the Harvard Psilocybin Project with Professor Richard Alpert to explore the effects of psychotropic substances on the human mind. They gave magic mushrooms and LSD to volunteer subjects and recorded their real-time descriptions of the experience. Being a Harvard professor and actively encouraging the use of psychedelic substances to young people made the government nervous. Both would end up leaving Harvard by 1963, but still sharing the understanding and knowledge gained from his research throughout the 60s and 70s.
Named Timothy Leary.
Leary was a Harvard professor, and he was one of those people who got one of the little packages from Sandoz Laboratories with a supply of LSD in it. And Leary had this gigantic experience, and he began to proselytize for it. For instance, once he proclaimed that LSD released a huge amount of energy, 90% of which was sexual energy. He said, no matter how great you think your sex life is, if you ever have sex while taking LSD, your normal sex life would be like making love to a department store mannequin. And so, of course, this got enormous attention.
And looking at the statements that he's been making over a period of time, as late as a month or so ago, indicates quite clearly that he was promoting the use of LSD, and promoting it in a way that it wasn't going to be supervised, and in my judgment, endangering the lives of many of our citizens, and particularly many of our young people.
When a Harvard professor began to preach this and to urge the youth of America to take LSD, this suddenly seemed like a huge cultural...
The contraceptive pill was released to the public in 1960. The Flintstones premiered on September 30th, 1960, at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and quickly became a hit.
You ever see the Flintstones? Sure. Do you think Wilma's sexy? Wilma Flintstone? Maybe we've been alone in deep space too long, but every time I see that show, her body drives me crazy. Is it me?
I think, in all probability, Wilma Flintstone is the most desirable woman who ever lived.
That's good. I thought I was going strange.
She's incredible.
What do you think of Betty?
Betty Rubble? Well, I would go with Betty. But I'd be thinking of Wilma.
This is crazy. Why are we talking about going to bed with Wilma Flintstone?
You're right. We're nuts. This is an insane conversation.
She'll never leave Fred, and we know it.
1962 saw the release of Lawrence of Arabia. Quote, "This epic film, with a running time of 227 minutes, rejects melodrama and standard tropes, instead relying on stunning visuals, an award-winning musical score, and a visionary cinematic style that would influence a host of future directors, including Steven Spielberg. The historical drama is based on the experiences of British Colonel T.E. Lawrence, who served as an advisor to Bedouin forces in their revolt against the Ottomans during World War I. It won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director." End quote. This was a release in color, and you have to see it to fully understand its effect on society. Or better yet, see it on acid.
For over a quarter of a century, controversy has raged around the name of T.E. Lawrence. No man of our time has drawn upon himself so much praise and so much criticism.
Also, in 1962,
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
10 days later she would end up taking her own life. Undoubtedly, the most significant event of 1962 happened in July, when an American spy plane spotted the presence of Soviet nuclear-armed missiles in Cuba, which led to a standoff, and JFK threatened Russia with war. The United States and the Soviet Union came very close to war with Fidel Castro, urging Russia's President Khrushchev to consider a nuclear first strike against the US. While the US military wanting to bomb Cuba with airstrikes, but the Russian leader eventually turned their ships around back to Russia. In October 1962, the US Navy detected the Russian submarine B-59 and dropped depth charges to force it up to the surface. But the captain of the sub thought that war had begun, so he wanted to launch a nuclear weapon. To launch a nuke, the order had to be agreed upon by 3 of the captains on board, and only one of the 3 voted against it. He eventually persuaded the others to surface and wait for orders from Russia. So, it was a very tense period filled with a lot of anxiety. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech during the March on Washington. In 1963, the act of one man set off a chain of events that led to a revolution, the fall of a regime, and even influenced America's involvement in the Vietnam War. The Burning Monk Incident. On the 8th of May, 1963, during the celebration of Gautama Buddha's birthday, in Hue, Vietnam, the government sent police to stop Buddhists from waving their religious flags. The police opened fire on the Buddhist celebration, killing 9 people. This act of discrimination sparked outrage among the Buddhists, leading to protests against the Diem regime, which discriminated against them and favored the Catholic minority. On June 11, 1963, in Saigon, South Vietnam, Thich Quang Duc, a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, set himself on fire to protest the persecution of Buddhists by the South Vietnamese government led by President Ngo Dinh Diem, a Roman Catholic. His act of sacrifice was captured by photographer Malcolm Brown and became a powerful symbol of resistance and the struggle for freedom. He chose a busy intersection in Saigon as the site of his protest. He sat down in a lotus position, poured gasoline over himself, and lit a match. He remained calm and silent as he burned to death. His fellow monks and nuns chanted prayers and slogans around him. The self-immolation shocked the world and made headlines in newspapers and magazines. President John F. Kennedy said that the photo of the burning monk had generated more emotion than any other news picture in history. He ordered a reassessment of the U.S. support for the Diem regime, which eventually led to a coup that overthrew and killed Diem in November 1963. The U.S. also increased its military involvement in Vietnam, which escalated into a full-scale war. Thich Quang Duc is revered as a martyr and a hero by many Buddhists and Vietnamese. His heart, which survived the fire, is considered a relic and is kept at a pagoda in Ho Chi Minh City. His act of self-immolation has inspired many other protests around the world, such as those by Tibetans, Iranians, and Tunisians. His image has also been used in various cultural and artistic works, such as songs, films, and paintings. But why were the Americans so involved in Vietnam? Another quick history lesson. The Vietnam War in 60 seconds. Firstly, after World War II, many countries had no system of government. The Russians wanted the countries without a government to become communist. America and the Allies wanted those countries to be democratic. Okay. So Vietnam used to belong to France, but by World War II Japan up and took it for itself, and when Japan surrendered after the atom bombs, Viet Minh, a communist-led organization, had taken over a large number of government buildings and declared independence from France. But the French tried to take it back. The Russians assisted the Viet Minh communists and refused to let it be taken by France, so the country was divided into two. Kinda like North and South Korea still is to this day. When the monk burned himself, America intervened and wanted the democratic side to take control, so it sent a whole bunch of troops to the country. The Russians provided the communists with financial and military aid, and after a long battle and many dead soldiers, the Americans ended up losing anyway, and the communists eventually won. So, to this day Vietnam is officially still a communist country. Well, kinda. It's actually become more of a socialist country. The 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. 1964. The U.S. military orders that 2.2 million American young men be drafted for the war in Vietnam. One day you might be a decent, law-abiding citizen, and the next day you're a criminal, because you don't want to be shipped off to go die in a foreign country. In 1964 Australia also enacted a draft for soldiers to send to Vietnam, but from 1966 to 1968 a growing force of conscientious objectors, inspired by America, grew in Australia, and by 1967 became openly popular due to a growing protest movement. Still 1964, the free speech movement begins at the University of California, Berkeley, with students protesting restrictions on political speech on campus. Also, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, making it illegal to discriminate against people based on race. The following footage is from 1964. There are two things to note in the footage: the lack of hippies, and then listen and take very careful note of the manner in which the young people speak, and the issues they put forth.
I believe the thing that keeps the world going is that people never can achieve anything to its fullest. You know, otherwise, if people could achieve everything, it would have to come to an end. It couldn't go on.
That's right.
You know,
because if you just
you have to have a goal. You have to have a road, but the road never ends.
A couple of days, I'll find out my something. It takes so long to find out what your something really is. You know, you just keep going and going and going.
Parents, they're afraid to face it. I mean, it's just rotten. The whole generation is just completely mashed out. They just don't care.
It's not that they lack concern, but they lack enough concern to really look at a problem and figure out what might be an answer, like the Cold War and all. Is that being square is out. That is to say.
In order for me to exist, I have to exist essentially outside of the system, because the system won't allow me to form. No matter what its formal structure is, we have to do a lot of research before we can find out what a different kind of society can be established. But you certainly can't do it from within.
Most children do take part in a lot of these. And as a result, why, probably the influence of the parent is somewhat diluted. You just don't, you don't have them under your control for as much as perhaps when I was in high school.
I feel that you take the time even to tell me anything that you're doing during the day to make me feel it all close to you. I can't just see you on Saturday night and Sunday and really feel part of your life.
Well, I just feel that you've got better things to worry about here at home and to worry about the problems that I encounter during the day.
1965. The Selma to Montgomery marches takes place, with civil rights activists marching from Selma, Alabama, to the state capitol in Montgomery to demand voting rights for African Americans. 1965 also brought a color television revolution, with NBC broadcasting the vast majority of its primetime programming in color at the start of the 1965 to 1966 season. In 1966, Muhamad Ali refused to be drafted into the military owing to his religious beliefs and ethical opposition to the Vietnam War, and was found guilty of draft evasion and stripped of his boxing titles. The government wanted to make an example out of him and wanted to lock him up, but he stayed out of prison while appealing the decision to the Supreme Court. Ali's actions as a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War made him an icon for the larger counterculture of the 1960s generation, and he was a very high-profile figure of racial pride for African Americans. That same year, 1966 protests against the Vietnam War began to escalate, with students across the country organizing teach-ins and demonstrations. LSD is declared illegal in America in 1966, with old people stating that it would lead to a collapse of society. 1967, The Human Being was a cultural event that took place on January 14, 1967, in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park polo fields. It was aimed at bringing together all the different counterculture movements of the time to unite against the government's clampdown on LSD and shrooms. It is rumored that Owsley parachuted down from a plane to the event to hand out 30,000 doses of LSD. But he later denied this. I mean, of course he would, because he was being monitored by the CIA and the FBI during this time. The Human Being was a prelude to the Summer of Love, which made the Haight-Ashbury district a symbol of American counterculture and introduced the word psychedelic to suburbia. The event drew more than 20,000 people and featured speakers like Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, Allen Ginsberg, and Jerry Rubin, as well as music from local rock bands like Jefferson Airplane, Grateful Dead, Big Brother and the Holding Company. The Human Being focused on key ideas of the 1960s counterculture, including personal empowerment, cultural and political decentralization, communal living, ecological awareness, higher consciousness, with the aid of psychedelic drugs, acceptance of psychedelics use, and radical political consciousness. The Human Being events led to word spreading all over America about the new movement, the new revolution, that was taking place in San Francisco, which would lead up to the now famous Summer of Love. The Summer of Love was a social phenomenon that occurred during the summer of 1967, when as many as 100,000 people, mostly young people from all over America, most of them dressed in hippie fashion, traveled to San Francisco to a neighborhood called the Haight-Ashbury. The event became a defining moment of the 1960s, and this event really brought the hippie counterculture movement to the awareness of the public on a global scale. Most of the historical hippie footage is from this era. To emphasize just how crazy this event was, you can't really call it an event, because it was a year-long event. San Francisco at this time was overflowing with hippies. People were tripping on acid all over, just thousands of hippies as far as you could see. People were making love just out in the open and drugs were free. Wait. What? Did you say free? Yes, free drugs everywhere you looked. There's even one report of a helicopter flying over and just dropping pages of acid everywhere. If you didn't know, LSD is produced on a sheet of paper, which is made up of like 200 to 300 little squares. Each one of those is a full dose. And that was dropping out of the air for free, while artists just got up and started performing for the masses of crowds of hippies. I remember when we were young, we were always being warned not to accept drugs from strangers, right? But no one offered us any drugs. In 1967, everyone was offering you drugs. As many as you'd like. No catch. Not like drug dealers today, the strategy is give you the first one free. To get you hooked. Then charge a whole lot. No, not like that, because LSD is not addictive. So it was really 100% free. And it was completely legal. It's probably why I love hippie culture so much. If you were there, everyone just genuinely cared about you. No matter who you are, what you looked like, you were loved. Without any strings attached. These days it's nearly impossible to find a generosity that's genuine. Everyone has some sort of angle. Here, use this, but it's only a demo, or a trial, you can only convert 200 characters. There's a time limit. Free does not even mean free anymore. After you click, you have to give your credit card details first, and then you'll get a free sample. We used to have a word for that. A con. In the past the word hustler was meant as someone trying to con you, a grifter. Now it's admirable to hustle someone out of their hard-earned cash. The problem is that everyone is out to con, to scam, to hustle, which is akin to the cycle of abuse. If everyone stopped conning, then there would be no need for scams. Everyone for himself just makes the whole world selfish, whereas we were supposed to be coming together as a people, to take care of each other. Instead we chose to go the other way. The way of the square. Now this is just my own opinion based on my own experience, but I think trauma shaped a lot of what was happening in the 60s. Remember in episode 1, we went through the list of what trauma symptoms manifest as. Just to name a few, sudden and extreme changes in behavior. Avoiding being placed on the spot. Being a people pleaser. Judging people to be either all good or all bad. Hippies saw everyone as good, as someone they could trust, which led to some of them being taken advantage of in terrible ways. But overall the Summer of Love was a success, letting the world know that the hippie movement was a massive cultural revolution. World War II left the whole world desperately wanting peace. And I think a lot of hippies were personally traumatized either by the reality of what family life was like back then, living with parents who were strict, emotionally unavailable, emotionally and physically abusive, racist, money-hungry, then also by the events that transpired in the 50s and 60s. And to top it off, the government trying to force young people to fight a war they did not believe in. The Summer of Love in 1967 is known as the peak of hippie culture, and it wasn't only young people. There were people of all ages actively searching for a new, different kind of lifestyle. What most of them were hoping for was a new way of life where people cared for one another, where love was the driving force instead of greed, ego, money, and the need to impress. Music was the force that brought them together. And if you were ever a troubled teen, then you know the powerful influence of music. Hippies of all ages came together at these music festivals, where they bonded and everyone was treated as equals. Not like today, where you have older people thinking they have the right to boss around and abuse the young. That young people are somehow beneath them, and the young retaliating, with elderly discrimination. At a music festival, no one said, "You are too young or too old to be here." At a music fest all you were is a fan of Bob Dylan. And with the disappearance of television and personalized music streaming, there is less for people of different generations to bond over. The event was supposed to bring together everyone who opposed the government's clampdown on LSD. Mainly the Vietnam War protesters and the hippies. The academics and the dropouts. The eggheads and the artists. Anyone who wasn't a square or a Fed was encouraged to show up, but unfortunately they were not the only ones who showed up. Free drugs, the gathering of young, vulnerable women and young men was obviously going to draw a lot of predators. Many young women were harassed, taken advantage of, and there were a number of reports of young women kidnapped by biker gangs and other predators.
You say that the people you were with were trying to blow your mind. What were they doing?
Well, they were just saying things like, oh, we're going to help you. I mean, just these things, and they just keep on saying it over and over in different kinds of talking. And these people were animals. I mean, strictly animals. I mean, they were, just a bunch of beasts. They didn't care what they did to you, what happened. And, I mean, it just really scared me.
Charles Manson was one of these predators. He was released from prison in March 1967, the year of the hippie, at the age of 28. He found himself in the middle of a town overrun by young people. Young people who had run away from home to travel to San Francisco in search of a different lifestyle. Hippies. Manson began to preach to these young people, and soon began to garner a group of 18 devoted female followers that moved into his girlfriend's apartment in San Francisco. They called themselves the Family. They were involved with crimes like robbery and car theft. The fact that hippies loved and accepted everyone was one of the many factors that resulted in their downfall. While the hippies believed that all people were good inside, today we now know that some people are too broken to reform, that there are many people who have completely lost that spark of good inside. You'll be quite surprised how many people are psychopaths in the real world. Another factor was that they had no plan. 100,000 people showed up at the Haight-Ashbury in 1967 to search for a new way to live, but they had no leadership, no coordination, no actuation. Their hearts were in the right place, and while they had the diggers, a group of wealthy artists, musicians and actors provided housing, shelter, food, clothing, and so forth. What they lacked was a plan. Imagine what a supervillain could accomplish with 100,000 soldiers. Eventually the money was going to run out, and it did. By the end of the year, most young people had returned home. A few of them found it too difficult to go back to regular society, so they went into the forest and started hippie communes, grew their own food, built cabins, and so forth. No two hippie communes were exactly the same though. Experiences differed vastly from one commune to the next. Some were just drug-fueled orgies, while others were more organized, grew their own crops, shared responsibilities, and so on. Some were leaderless, some were completely moneyless, while others traded with nearby towns and villages. As you can imagine, some lasted longer than others. In late 1967, Owsley's lab at La Espiral, Orinda, California, was raided by police, and he was found in possession of 350,000 doses of LSD and 1,500 doses of STP. His defense was that the illegal substances were for personal use, but he was found guilty and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He never manufactured LSD again after that. Well, not for commercial use that we know of anyway. The war on drugs. After the feds shut down Owsley's LSD lab, hippies had to look to other sources for their drugs. During the 60s, motorcycle gangs had set up their own meth labs to supply amphetamines for their members. Crystal meth and angel dust were the drugs of choice for biker gangs. Angel dust is normally added to weed and consumed by smoking. Some weed smokers were sometimes unknowingly passed a joint laced with PCP. It fell upon these underground lab chemists to fill that gap in the market to produce LSD. So now many young people were suddenly exposed to the underground criminal element of society thanks to the illegalization of LSD, which led to an increase in violent and sexual attacks on young women. And an increase in young people trying numerous other drugs, like angel dust, cocaine and heroin. So great job there, FBI, DEA and government. Great job at keeping young people safe. Contrary to what you might believe, psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin, the active chemical in magic mushrooms, are not like stimulants such as cocaine and crystal meth. You can't become physically addicted to them. The way stimulants like meth and cocaine and amphetamines work is that they speed up the processing power of the brain. Kinda like overclocking. The problem is that in high doses it brings a sense of euphoria while the dose in your brain remains high. As the level drops, you need to take more to keep feeling good. Especially if it's being smoked. Which is why meth heads go for many days without sleep. They can't let go of the high, otherwise it leads to a come down, which feels like a major depressive episode. The problem with this is that not sleeping for a couple of days will lead to hallucinations, irrational thinking, and insanity. With LSD and shrooms and ecstasy, it does not lead to a high like heroin. It creates a desire to bond with people, to socialize, and share with others, which is why it's so effective during therapy. It also cures addiction. That's right, if you have a meth head in your family, get them some LSD quick. These underground dealers also were not interested in preserving the purity of the LSD they were selling, so it was common to find LSD laced with other drugs like meth, because meth is much cheaper to manufacture. The reason you don't find LSD these days is simply because it's not as profitable. It costs a lot to manufacture, and because it's not addictive, it's not as easy to sell as, say, cocaine or meth. If you were a drug kingpin, would you rather manufacture crystal meth, which has a huge demand, very easy to sell so you get rid of it very quickly, and has 1 million customers already addicted to it, or spend $5,000 on proper lab equipment to manufacture a product that you have to search very hard for to find customers? Which means you must hold onto the product for a while. With the feds actively trying to throw you in jail, also, what cartel wants to manufacture the cure for addiction, when their business depends on addiction. So over time, as boomers grew older, and LSD being illegal, the market faded away, with it being extremely hard to find these days. In 1968, the Manson family moved to Los Angeles, where Charles Manson tried and failed to become a musician after becoming friends with one of the Beach Boys. In California, the Manson family grew to about 100 members. They lived in a commune on Spawn Ranch, which was used to shoot old Western movies. The Tet Offensive was a major escalation and one of the largest military campaigns of the Vietnam War.
The war had come to the streets of Saigon.
It was launched by the Communist forces of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong against South Vietnam and its American allies on January 30, 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year festival called Tet. The offensive aimed to spark a rebellion among the South Vietnamese people and persuade the Americans to withdraw from the war. However, the attacks were mostly repelled by the South Vietnamese and U.S. forces, causing heavy casualties for the Communists. The Tet Offensive is considered a turning point in the Vietnam War, as it shocked the American public and eroded support for the war effort. In 1968, students at Columbia University in New York City staged a week-long occupation of campus buildings to protest the university's ties to the military-industrial complex. Later that year, police clashed with anti-war protesters outside the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
The protesters challenged the police clubbed the protesters.
Protesters, journalists, local residents, and even members of the clergy are beaten by police. They use so much tear gas, it seeps into the lobby of the Hilton Hotel.
1968 also saw the assassinations of two prominent American leaders, civil rights activist Martin Luther King Jr. in April and Democratic presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy in June. The student protests and riots that erupted in many countries, such as France, Germany, Mexico, and the United States, demanding social and political reforms. On Christmas Eve, 1968, the crew of Apollo 8 captured a spectacular sight as they orbited the moon, the illuminated Earth appearing above the barren lunar horizon. The NASA astronauts were awestruck by what they saw. "Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty?" Bill Anders shouted at fellow astronaut Jim Lovell. "You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color, quick, would you?" "That's a beautiful shot," said Lovell as Anders clicked the shutter and captured what has become one of the world's most famous photographs. The image was called Earthrise. It was the first color photograph of Earth taken from space and quickly became famous around the world. The photo is widely credited with propelling the global environmental movement and leading to the creation of Earth Day in 1970, an annual event promoting environmental activism and awareness. In December 1968, a young couple was shot by a strange man while they parked at a lover's lane. The young man survived, but the girl did not. In July of 1969, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Examiner newspaper containing a message written in a secret code. The letter stated that the author had shot numerous victims, and the code was published in a number of newspapers. When a couple, who were school teachers, managed to break the code, the message read, "I like killing people because it is so much fun." This was the origin of the Zodiac. This mysterious killer was linked to numerous killings and letters sent to newspapers containing various secret coded messages. The term serial killer would only be invented by 1974. That identity of the Zodiac has never been solved, and one of his secret codes, which is said to contain his identity, has also never been cracked by law enforcement officials, professional code breakers, and armchair criminologists for over 50 years. While officially connected to 5 murders and 2 attempted murders, the Zodiac hinted he had killed at least 37 victims. After taunting the police and the public with nearly 24 letters, he seemed to vanish in the late 1970s. But his legacy endures, having inspired 3 real-life copycat killers. On the 28th of June, 1969, when police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York City, the patrons and residents began to fight back. The 5 days of rioting which followed sparked the creation of the gay rights movement. In August 1969, the original Woodstock Festival brought together nearly 500,000 people in a celebration of peace, music and love. Held on 15 to the 18th of August, 1969, at Max Yasker's 2,500 square dairy farm near White Lake in Bethel, New York. Do you know how big that is? One farm that is 50 kilometers across from side to side in either direction. To get to the end could take up to an hour to drive going at a speed of 50 kilometers per hour. And that is assuming that you're taking a straight route and that the land is perfectly square. I mean, who even owns that much land? Anyway, it was one of the largest and most influential events of the 1960s counterculture movement, attracting more than 400,000 people and featuring 32 acts, including Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, and Santana. Can you picture almost 500,000 people gathering on a farm? No, you can't. That's impossible to imagine, but it did happen. That would never happen today, because everyone is afraid being sued. The festival was meant to celebrate peace and music, but it did also face many challenges, such as bad weather, lack of security, and insufficient toilet facilities. Even so, the festival was a major success, and to this day it is still considered the most famous music festival of all time. The festival came at a time when the young people of America needed that musical outlet, says George Weremchuk, a professor of music that teaches a course on rock music, which includes Woodstock as part of its curriculum. It was a once-in-a-lifetime event, Weremchuk says. They try to duplicate it, and you just can't fabricate it. Everything just kind of came into balance. The location was ideal, the lineup was incredible, and it was strikingly peaceful for such a massively attended event. So how did they get so many people to attend without social media like Facebook and Twitter? Back then, organizers posted advertisements in newspapers all over the country. Also, an article was published in Rolling Stone's magazine. They thought maybe 150,000 people, 50,000 a day. They had no idea how many people would come, Weremchuk says. During that weekend of the festival, it actually became the 2nd or 3rd largest city in New York. The small rural area didn't have the infrastructure to support 400,000 people. The locals didn't want hippies there, he says. There had already been festivals in previous years, and the locals didn't want that many people invading their little bucolic towns. Due to this pushback, organizers barely obtained permits by the 2nd of August. The fact that everything aligned so perfectly, and the festival actually happened, is a miracle. Several events in the late 1960s served as a catalyst for the festival's massive draw, such as America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Many of the people who attended the festival were against the war and protested it, Weremchuk says. The civil rights movement was also heavy in the minds of people that age. The 2 people who could have changed things were assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr., and a few months later, Robert Kennedy, Weremchuk adds. Young people became disillusioned with government and what they thought America stood for, and a counterculture evolved. Some attendees felt they were the only people in their town that believed what they believed in and looked the way they did, and all of a sudden, you have hundreds of thousands of like-minded people together, and there was a community that many of these people didn't know existed. Woodstock was scheduled to end in the evening of Sunday, August 18th, But due to rainy conditions, it concluded on the following morning, with Jimi Hendrix playing the last set at 9 a.m. Even though tickets were advertised for $7, the event organizers could not finish preparations in time, so there were no fences or ticket booths. Most people who showed up just walked in. So the event ran at a loss, ending up losing $1 million. Woodstock ultimately became a symbol of the hippie generation and a milestone in rock and roll history. Unfortunately, at the time, Woodstock was overshadowed in the news by the brutal murders committed by the Manson family just 7 days before.
Who starred in Valley of the Dolls, was 8 months pregnant and was found in a bikini-type nightgown with a rope around her neck attached to the body of a man, discovered this morning by a maid who ran screaming to neighbors. One officer summed up the murders when he said, "In all my years, I have never seen anything like this before."
There were 2 more murders 15 miles away in the Silver Lake section of Los Angeles.
Tex and I had our own special little stash of cocaine. I think it was cocaine or methadone, I'm not sure which. We were speed, and we both snorted some speed and got in the car. We were very, very wired. And then was instructed to kill him. Our hands, and I couldn't put the knife down. I couldn't bring it down. It was just as though there was a force there that held my wrist, and I couldn't. I undid the ties, the towel that I had tied his wrist with, and he and I began to fight. And I remember I was screaming for help, and he was screaming for help, and then Tex came, and I was left sitting with Sharon Tate, and she was talking to me, and I remember that I had I felt nothing. I felt absolutely nothing for her as she begged for her life and for the life of her baby.
On the 8th of August 1969, members of the Manson family arrived at the Hollywood Hills home of Sharon Tate, where they stabbed, beat and shot to death the young actress and her friends, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and aspiring screenwriter Wojciech Frykowski. They were actually sent by Manson to slay everyone in all the houses on that street. The reason for this was that Charles Manson had begun to preach to his followers that a race war was about to erupt in America between black people and white people. That black people would ultimately win the war, and that they would eventually become followers of Manson himself. According to him, the war was taking too long to start, so the murders were supposed to kick-start this war, which he named Helter Skelter. They were eventually captured, and Manson and 3 members of the family received life sentences for the murders of 7 people in total. Many adults then started to blame the events on hippie culture, and eventually everything wrong in society were blamed on hippies, like crime, homelessness, drug abuse, prostitution, anything you could think of. For old people, it was the fault of the younger generation, and particularly the hippie culture. The Isle of Wight Festival was held on 29 to 31 August 1969 at Wootton Creek, United Kingdom, on the Isle of Wight. The festival attracted an audience of approximately 150,000 to see acts including Bob Dylan, the band, The Who, Free, Joe Cocker, the Bonzo Dog Band, and the Moody Blues. It was the second of 3 music festivals held on the island between 1968 and 1970. It became a legendary event, largely owing to the participation of Bob Dylan, who had spent the previous 3 years in retirement. The event was well managed, in comparison to the recent Woodstock Festival, and trouble-free, with estimates ranging from 600 to 700,000. September 1969, a large group of hippies took over an empty mansion in a posh London neighborhood, at number 144 Piccadilly Street. They called themselves the London Street Commune. The group of hippies barricaded themselves in the mansion and resisted attempts to remove them, in what has become known as the Battle of Piccadilly. Their leader, Dr. John Moffat, was a professor of history. He said to reporters that the group was formed to defend the interest of beat groups and to fight police control to bring power back to the community. "We want Piccadilly to become a real people's forum," he stated. a forum for the understanding which would act as a resistance against all institutions like the family, the school, detention centers, and so on, which exist to domesticate us compulsorily into the non-values of straight society. They also wanted to raise awareness of homelessness in London. On the 18th of September, 1969, a High Court judge ordering that the hippies give back the property, but the hippies threatened to fortify the building and commented to the press, "We shall use as much force and violence as is needed to stay in the building." While they boarded up the 3-story building, a Hell's Angel stood in front of the window that they used as a door. 2 days later, when police showed up, the hippies threw plastic balls at them from the roof and from top-floor windows, as a crowd of 200 people looked on. In another incident, some hippie youths armed with wooden sticks clashed with police, and a bleeding girl was rushed to the hospital due to head injuries. Chaos reigned over the next few weeks, with one newspaper reporting, "Hippies, squatting in a mansion in Piccadilly, London, rained hundreds of brightly coloured plastic balls on onlookers today, injuring 2 policemen, as they prepared to repel attempts at eviction." The hippies had stockpiled thousands of brightly coloured bull balls to use for the attacks. The antics at the mansion brought crowds of onlookers to Piccadilly, and it soon became London's hottest tourist attraction. The battle ended peacefully after 3 weeks, when police tricked the hippies into opening the building, saying that they needed to assist a young pregnant woman in the building, who needed to go to the hospital. 5 of the hippies were arrested and given a 3-month jail sentence. On the 6th of December, 1969, as the final show of their American tour, the Rolling Stones held a one-day rock festival at Altamont Speedway in Livermore, California. Inspired by the more famous Woodstock, the free event was intended as a thank-you gesture by the band to their fans and was to feature Santana, the Jefferson Airplane, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Crosby, Stills and Nash, and the Rolling Stones themselves. Approximately 300,000 attended the concert. The Grateful Dead were also scheduled to perform, but shortly before their scheduled appearance, they chose not to, due to the increasing violence at the venue. That's the way things went at Altamont, so badly that the Grateful Dead, the prime organizers and movers of the festival, didn't even get to play, wrote staff at Rolling Stone magazine in a detailed narrative on the event, terming it, "Rock and Roll's all-time worst day, December 6th, a day when everything went perfectly wrong." The event was haphazardly organized, and for security, they hired the Hells Angels motorcycle gang. Trouble started early on, when Marty Ballin of the Jefferson Airplane was knocked down with a Hells Angels pull cue, and a confused naked man was beaten to the ground. When the crowd became difficult to control, people rushed the stage. The Rolling Stones were even threatened by the biker gang when they refused to go on stage. An 18-year-old African-American man rushed the stage with a gun and was stabbed to death before Mick Jagger's eyes. Much has been written about Altamont as the day the 60s died, and the anti-Woodstock. Some historical events of 1970 were: January 4th, a magnitude 7.7 earthquake struck Tonghai County, China, killing at least 15,000 people. The 10th of April, Paul McCartney announces that he is leaving the Beatles for personal and professional reasons. The 11th of April, Apollo 13 is launched. On the 13th of April, an oxygen tank aboard Apollo 13 explodes, putting the crew in great danger and causing major damage to the spacecraft while en route to the moon. The world was in suspense, not knowing whether the astronauts on board would make it back safely.
This is Houston. Say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem.
On the 17th of April, the ill-fated Apollo 13 spacecraft returns to Earth, and all the astronauts arrived back safely. The 15th of June, 1970, Charles Manson goes on trial for the Sharon Tate murders. After the Manson family murders, millions were ready to believe that hippies were drug-crazed maniacs, whose experimentation with drugs led to their impulse toward murder and insanity.
5 months, and they vow to remain here until Charlie is fragile, waiting for Charlie. What about a new leader?
We don't even think about him not coming out because he is.
He is going to get out. And he'll be out when all the jails open up.
The public felt that if the hippie movement was turning out murderers, then drugs had to be behind it. On the 4th of November, Jeannie, the 13-year-old feral child, is found in Los Angeles, California, having been locked in a bedroom for most of her life. The Polish 1970 protests, in Gdynia, soldiers fire at workers emerging from trains. The 1970 Polish protests occurred in northern Poland. The protests were sparked by a sudden increase in the prices of food and other everyday items. Strikes were put down by the Polish People's Army and the Citizens' Militia, resulting in at least 44 people killed and more than 1,000 wounded. The protests were a precursor to the formation of the Solidarity movement, which played a significant role in the eventual collapse of the communist regime in Poland. The hippie counterculture emerged in Poland in the late 1960s and continued to thrive until the early 1970s. The hippies in Poland were searching for an alternative way of life to both communism and traditional national culture, while also distancing themselves from any anti-communist or reform movements. They created unique personal styles, formed communes, and experimented with sex and drugs. Hippie culture also spread all around the world, with music being the catalyst. Hippies could be found in countries such as Ibiza, Spain, India, Australia, Denmark, and even in Soviet Russia a large hippie movement had formed.
We love rock and roll, peace, love and freedom. Не любил мыться, стричься, але ще не смажу. Ja смажу?
Sain teada, et Tartus on, et Riias on, Leningradis on, et Moskvas on, Novosibirskis on, et Irkutskis on, et Sevastoopolis on, et Kiievis on, et Lvovis on. Hipirahvast on pea kõigis tolleaegse NSV Liidu suuremates linnades. Et ma ei ole üksi, et meid on palju.
In 1970 a bunch of young people had managed to smuggle in a bunch of music albums. Albums like the Beatles and Grateful Dead was particularly favored and brought with it the hippie lifestyle. In Soviet Russia young people began to grow their hair, experimented with drugs, free love and dressed like hippies. Being in possession of American music during the Cold War was illegal, and many of them did get arrested and harassed by the police. Their story can be seen in the movie, Soviet Hippies. And even to this day there are still hippies in Russia. Although swingers, also known as wife swapping, has been reported in America as early as 1950, it was during the 70s that the practice really became popular, mostly due to the free love movement of the 60s.
Climate was changing.
You care to play? It's strictly volunteer, of course.
A key party? The men put their car keys in a bowl, and at the end of the evening the women line up and fish them out.
During this time swingers would host what's known as key parties. When couples arrive, they would drop their car keys into a large bowl, and at some point, during the party, wives would then randomly choose one of the keys, and whoever's key they would retrieve was the husband that they would end up having relations with. The 70s is also a time when many famous serial killers operated, like Ted Bundy, son of Sam, David Berkowitz, the Sunday morning slasher, who killed 80 women, Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, and Rodney Alcala, who is believed to have killed between 50 and 130 people between 1971 to 1979. It was a dangerous time for hippies to be roaming the streets. From 1969 to 1971, one preacher grew his small congregation from 80 members to thousands by preaching a message of economic socialism and racial equality. This one man was responsible for hospitals in the United States to desegregate their wards, when in 1961, he was hospitalized and was accidentally placed in a black ward. When staff wanted to move him to a white ward, he refused. Instead, he began to make the beds and empty the bedpans of black patients. When word spread about his actions, the public demanded that hospitals end the practice of segregation. His organization welcomed people of every race and ethnicity. They helped anyone that needed assistance, the homeless, the hungry, the unemployed, alcoholics and other addicts. Members were given food, shelter, and even jobs. They built old age homes to care for the elderly. They ran half a dozen foster homes for orphan children. And they managed a ranch that was licensed to care for the mentally disabled. His message was particularly popular with young people and African Americans, anyone who was sick of racial discrimination within the country. He also helped bring an end to stores and businesses denying black customers to enter their stores by encouraging his members to shop at stores that ended the practice, which led to huge increases in profits. Essentially the opposite of what we call canceling. Vernon Gosney, a white man with a black wife, recalls the discrimination they faced. We were not accepted. Her family didn't accept me. My family didn't accept her. And it was really important to us to have a place, to be in a place where we were accepted and embraced and celebrated. The church they originally approached had refused to marry them. In fact, interracial marriage was still illegal in some states in 1967. Tim Stone, a former member, states, "When I saw Jim kiss old black ladies on the cheek and their eyes would light up, I would cry. I was so touched." Deborah Layton and others strove to be more like their non-white friends, wearing their hair in afros and generally denouncing their privileged status as whites. Between 1974 to 1978, more than 900 members had moved to the jungle in Guyana to build their own commune, called Jonestown. The legacy of Jonestown has since been immortalized with the phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid," when more than 900 members ended their own lives, some voluntarily, and others at gunpoint, by drinking Kool-Aid laced with cyanide. Former member Tim Carter said the temple moved to Jonestown because in '74, what we saw in the United States was creeping fascism. Carter explained, "It was apparent that corporations, or the multinationals, were getting much larger, their influence was growing within the government, and the United States is a racist place." Their members joined because they believed in a society where people of all races could live and work together. They joined because they wanted to prove to the world that a new type of society was possible. A society devoid of racism and greed, where everyone was cared for and no one was left behind to starve and die homeless on the streets. It is evident that the congregants of People's Temple genuinely found happiness in fellowship, regardless of race. Jonestown had the potential to become the most successful hippie commune of all time, but it eventually fell victim to the disillusionment of its leader, who became power-hungry, money-hungry, and suffered severe bouts of paranoia and insanity, most likely from amphetamine abuse, believing that he was above the rules and the laws he bestowed onto his followers. In his disillusioned state he eventually became the very thing that he despised. He felt that the people who joined were his property to use and exploit, and when some of his members wanted to leave he took it personally, and followed through on threats he had made many times before, that he would rather kill everyone than allow some of them to leave. The Anthill Gang. Rock Therio was a man with a mission, to save himself and his followers from the coming apocalypse. Therio was a charismatic man, good at persuading others to do his bidding. He convinced an entire group of people to quit their jobs and form a religious group, called the Anthill Kids. He started calling himself Moses. And in 1977 they formed a commune in Ontario, Canada. Like a typical cult, members were restricted from speaking to each other without Therio's permission, and were encouraged to snitch on each other. Members who disobeyed him were subjected to brutal torture. The Anthill Kids made their living by selling baked goods. And when some seemed not devoted enough, he would punish them. If a person wished to leave the sect, Therio would become enraged. He would hit them with belts or hammers, he would suspend them from the ceiling, he would let other members pluck each and every hair on their body individually, or he would defecate on them. He became convinced that the world would end in 1979, and drove his commune into the Canadian wilderness. 1979 came and went, but the world did not end. Therio ended up having 26 children with his female followers over the next 10 years. The children would end up being taken away by welfare authorities due to abuse. If he suspected one of his followers of being ill, he would perform surgery on them, without any form of anesthesia. The patient was usually held down, fully conscious, by the other followers, and Therio would use kitchen knives and pliers to perform these surgeries. Other forms of punishment included forcing commune members to break the legs of other members with a sledgehammer, to shoot each other in the shoulder, and to eating their own and others' feces. When one of his followers complained of pain in her abdomen, Therio forced her to undress, laid her on the kitchen table, punched her in the stomach, performed an enema by placing a tube up her rectum, and filled her up with olive oil. Then he cut her stomach open, ripped out parts of her intestines with his bare hands, and he forced another member to stitch her up. The woman expired the next day. He then tried to resurrect the woman by drilling a hole in her skull and having every male member ejaculate into it. Spoiler alert. It didn't work. One of his children also lost his life during a failed circumcision, and another when he was left outside in the middle of a storm. A woman named Gabrielle tried to escape after she endured blowtorches held to her genitals, 8 of her teeth pulled out, and a hypodermic needle breaking off in her spine, but she ended up going back when she had nowhere else to go to. As punishment for leaving, her hand was nailed to a table and her arm amputated with a hunting knife.
Believe me, I was sure that I would die that night. I was really certain I would die.
Only after Rock cut off parts of her breasts and smashed her head in with an axe, did she decide to escape and run to a police station. Therio was arrested in 1989 and given a life sentence. He would end up being taken out by his cellmate in 2011. The cellmate walked up to the guard station, handed them a knife, and said, "That piece of shit is down on the range. Here's the knife, I've sliced him up." Therio was 63 years old. The weirdest part is that even after all that Rock had done wrong, his followers remained loyal to him and still followed his orders to the very end. Why does this story matter? Well, when reporters began to harass the group, the townspeople defended the group. The people of the town believed that they were just a bunch of peace-loving hippies that wanted to live a holistic lifestyle close to nature.
It's just... But they actually duped people. They made people believe that they were just wanting to have this nice little lifestyle.
Canadians are generally known for their kind and friendly nature. It seems counterintuitive, but hippies can only be successful if they have a leader, yet, when they do, the leaders become drunk with power, and it all turns into a disaster. Is it just the nature of man, or is it because they always seem to follow the wrong leader? I think it's a human flaw. That humans always want to follow someone that steps up. The problem is that those who step up are always power-hungry narcissists, psychopaths, or just plain douchebags. The so-called alpha male. What hippies, and the human race in general, need to do is choose someone who does not want to be the leader. Someone that's been proven to be generally nice, like Keanu Reeves. Just call him up and say, "Look, you are the president now. You don't have to come into the office, but we will text you when we need you to make a big decision." Done, world saved. Then let's see if the outcome is the same.
Bong!
While Jim Jones was buzzed on amphetamines, and Rock was an alcoholic, notably there were no evil cult leaders that were taking LSD. Well, except for Ted Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. Kaczynski entered Harvard University at 16 years old on a scholarship in 1960. He was a math genius and graduated to become a professor. It was there that he was subjected to an experiment run by Harvard psychologist Henry A. Murray that was backed by the Central Intelligence Agency. Though he graduated with a mathematics degree, later completing a doctorate in the field before becoming a professor, questions remain over whether, or to what extent, he was affected by the experiment, which reportedly involved mock interrogations in which participants' beliefs were harshly disparaged. Murray's study was widely reported to be part of a CIA program, code-named Project MKUltra. The program sought to understand how to control subjects' minds, sometimes using substances such as LSD, according to a document that the CIA made publicly available in 2018. Kaczynski, a former mathematics professor with a Harvard education, came to the attention of the public in 1978 with the explosion of his first, primitive homemade bomb at a Chicago university. Over the next 17 years, he mailed or hand-delivered a series of increasingly sophisticated bombs that killed 3 Americans and injured nearly 24 more. Along the way, he sowed fear and panic, even threatening to blow up airliners in flight. The Unabomber conducted a nationwide bombing campaign against people he believed were advancing modern technology and the destruction of the environment, which he argued in his writings was detrimental to human freedom and dignity. Most of his targets comprised scientists and academics, but he also set off bombs in computer stores. His attacks killed 3 people and gravely injured 23 others. Manson also claimed to be part of MKUltra, but it's been reported that while he did use LSD as part of his technique to brainwash his followers, it was said that he chose to remain sober while doing so. Many say that the original hippies sold out during the 80s, but that's too much of an overgeneralization that completely dismisses the individual human experience. Hippies throughout history. Although the term hippie was coined in the late 60s, there have been others throughout history that have lived a hippie lifestyle. Long before Nazis took over, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the German Lebensreform was a movement that emphasized the goodness of nature, the harms to society, people, and nature caused by industrialization, the importance of the whole person, body and mind, and the goodness of the old ways. The German youth movement known as Der Wandervogel grew out of Lebensreform, or life reform, which is the German generic term for various social reform movements that started since the mid-19th century and originated especially in the German Empire and later in Switzerland. Common features were the criticism of industrialization, materialism, and urbanization combined with striving for the state of nature. The painter and social reformer Karl Wilhelm Diefenbach is considered to be an important pioneer of the Lebensreform ideas. There were many various movements even though they did not have an overarching organization. Inspired by the works of Friedrich Nietzsche, Goethe, and others, they attracted thousands of young Germans who rejected the rapid trend toward urbanization and yearned for the pagan, back-to-nature spiritual life of their ancestors. The Lebensreform would eventually evolve to the nudist movement, which was invented in the 1920s. The Nature Boys of Southern California. During the early 1900s, these beliefs were introduced to the United States as Germans settled around the country, some opening the first health food stores. For example, Santa Barbara's first health food store was opened in 1934 by Hermann Sechsauer, who was born in Tenningen, Germany on the 4th of March, 1883 and died in December 1971. He left Germany in 1906, arrived in New York, ended up in California and lived a pacifist, raw vegan, nonconformist lifestyle. Many moved to Southern California, where they could practice an alternative lifestyle in a warm climate. In turn, young Americans adopted the beliefs and practices of the new immigrants. One group, called the Nature Boys, who included William Pester, took to the California desert, raised organic food, and espoused a back-to-nature lifestyle. Eden Arbez, a member of this group, wrote a hit song, Nature Boy, which was recorded in 1947 by Nat King Cole, popularizing the homegrown back-to-nature movement to mainstream America. Eventually, a few of these Nature Boys, including the famous Gypsy Boots, made their way to Northern California in 1967, just in time for the Summer of Love in San Francisco. Bohemians are people who live an unconventional an artistic lifestyle, often rejecting the norms and expectations of mainstream society. The term originated from the French word for the Romani people, often pejoratively referred to as gypsies, who were mistakenly thought to have come from Bohemia, a region in the Czech Republic. The term Bohemianism emerged in France in the early 1800s, which were used to describe urban dwellers who took part in voluntary poverty and lived a nomadic lifestyle. Bohemians were associated with unorthodox or anti-establishment political or social viewpoints expressed through free love, frugality, and simple living. In the 1850s, Bohemian culture started to become established in the United States via immigration. In New York City in 1857, a group of 15 to 20 young, cultured journalists flourished as self-described Bohemians until the American Civil War began in 1861. Mark Twain included himself and Charles Warren Stoddard in the Bohemian category in 1867. Twain is famous for his novels, which include The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, 1876, and its sequel, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1884. In more modern times, Bohemian became associated with van dwelling. Dancing plague of 1518 is usually described as hundreds of citizens which danced uncontrollably and apparently in a zombie-like state for days on end. The event lasted for about 2 months before ending as mysteriously as it began. The story goes as follows. In July 1518, a woman named Frau stepped into the street and began dancing. She was unable to stop, and she kept dancing until she collapsed from exhaustion. After resting, she resumed the compulsive frenzied activity. She continued this way for days, and within a week more than 30 other people were similarly afflicted. They kept going long past the point of injury. City authorities were alarmed by the ever-increasing number of dancers. The people in charge thought that they needed to get it out of their system, and that more dancing was the solution, and so they arranged for a hall for the dancers to gather in, musicians to accompany the dancing, and professional dancers to help the afflicted to continue dancing. The number of dancers grew to as many as 400 people, and a number of them died. After 2 months the plague stopped. Now, take into account that these so-called news reports were recorded by highly religious and superstitious older people. People who were constantly complaining about how young people's dancing would lead to the end of the world. Does that remind you of anything today? In 100 years, are we going to read about how young people picked up a phone and were unable to put it down, afflicted by the phone plague? What could have been a few young people having fun, unlike the previous generation, the old fuddy-duddies of the time, was now suddenly described as a dancing plague, because young people like to dance, whereas the previous generation did not dance when they were a child, because they spent their youths working the cornfields. How many times have we seen parents go into a panic because their kids like to do things differently than what they did as young people? So 400 young people showed up at a music festival, dancing all night, licking toads and looking to score. That a hall was hired, with local bands playing music and young people did the unimaginable, they had fun. Oh, the humanity! Can you blame them? They lived in homes with no toilet, they didn't even have toilet paper or deodorant. They only bathed once a year, and they were exploited by the rich, to work hard so that they are allowed to eat rotting food, because all the good food had to be sent to the palace. And to top it off, if the king decided to go to war, you had no say in the matter. Of course they needed an outlet. They seemed unable to stop. Meaning that their parents said, "Stop dancing," and they disobeyed. It must be the devil, right? Some sort of affliction, because when we were young we had respect, not like these young people today. Remember what the newspapers said when parents saw teenage girls scream at an Elvis concert for the first time. They went into a panic and wanted the singer arrested for being a pervert that drove their little darling children to, quote, sexual perversion and hysteria. So, the reporting of the dancing plague might be just a tad bit biased and exaggerated. I mean, what kind of leaders would hire a dance hall and a band for young people who they thought were in a zombie-like state, possessed by demons? It is highly likely that those town officials saw young people dancing in the streets and decided to create the first nightclub, charging young people 1 straw penny to enter and making a fortune.
Wow, how much did all that cost?
Back in the 50s, 1 straw penny.
A whole straw penny?
Indeed. Follow me.
They then justified their actions afterwards by saying it was a plague that young people needed to, quote, get out of their system. And when 2 kids died from dehydration, just like there are young people today, who die at raves and music festivals, they blamed a plague, demonic possession. We were only trying to help by hiring a band and selling alcohol. Just like old people who burned young women to death for being witches at the Salem witch trials. Just because young people wanted to live their own lives and decided they didn't want to grow up to be their parents. Again, the old people panicked and blamed a black woman for turning their young people, young women, into witches, which started when a young girl giggled during church, probably because her friend was making a joke or telling her that her crush was winking at her, so, let's burn her to death, right? The Moneyless Man. In 2008, Mark Boyle, an economist, decided to conduct an experiment. He decided to live for a year without money, to see what would happen and if it could be possible. When the year was finished, he found that he was unable to go back to his regular lifestyle, and has been living a completely moneyless existence ever since.
And so it made me question everything about the way we were living.
He has written 3 books on the topic, and his website now hosts members of over 150 groups from all around the world. His message to the world is that money creates distance between people and the things that they consume. For instance, the food we buy at the store. We have no concept of where it comes from, who grew it. If the people who grew it are being exploited and taken advantage of, we will buy too much of it. And if it goes to waste, who cares? Because it only costs 10 cents. So throw it in the trash. If we grew that food, or even if we bought that food from our neighbor, after seeing her grow that from the ground up, we would have a greater respect for the things we own, consume, or gave to others.
A few things, but for example, food. I grow all my own food. I forage some food from the wild. I do a little bit of bartering, which is not my ideal, but I do a little bit of bartering for things like grains. I live in a off-grid caravan, so I produce my own energy. I cook outside every day. I wash in a river. I've got a wood burner made from an old gas bottle where I chop wood and use the wood to heat my caravan.
He also states that if we grew too much food, we would be more inclined to give the excess away to those who would appreciate it, and likely would return us the favor someday. By forming a local economy, where everything that we need is being produced within our own community, it would lead to an end to many evils in the world like slave labor, food shortages, selfishness, greed, price hiking, homelessness, and so forth. Also, being free from cash had led to him being happier and more connected with his community, with nature, and with his mental well-being. How many times haven't we faced dire consequences of being reliant on the monetary system? When COVID hit, we couldn't import food, clothing, electronics or medicine from overseas. The economy almost collapsed because we didn't know how to make our own food, our own medicine, and because we refused to share with each other. It took a pandemic to force scientists and corporations to share knowledge and work together to finally produce instant results and get a vaccine up and running in weeks. But as soon as that was done, we just went right back to being selfish. They still can't even cure the common cold, AIDS, cancer. Because they refuse to share knowledge with each other because there is money to be made. When Russia waged a war with Ukraine a million miles away, we found that our food prices suddenly doubled. Why? Because we didn't bother to learn how to create vehicles that can drive without oil. Oil that we need to buy from a country on the other side of the world. With money. Even if we do produce our own oil, it is bought and paid for by other countries, who then sells it back to us, because there is money to be made. Profit margins. Money. It acts as a barrier to scientific progress, to human kindness, and basic human decency.
So the world of free economy already exists. It's just all I'm asking people to do is actually expand. To expand the spirit of unconditional giving to humanity at large. It shows you that there's many lenses through which you can see the world. So the lens that we've had on for the longest time now is a lens called How Much Can I Get? And what I'm trying to say to people is that on the table in front of you there are a number of lenses. If you take off this lens, How Much Can I Get? And stick on a new lens called How Much Can I Give? And my message is very, very simple one. It's not complicated. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to understand it. It's about unconditional giving. It's about giving because what other reason do we need to give other than somebody needs help? Go and be the change you want to see in the world. Have no discrepancy between here, and between here. Thank you very much.
Final chapter. While it might seem that the hippie movement has failed, and indeed, many of them did fail, we cannot say that about all of the hippies. There are still a few hippie communes around the world that have survived up until today. So have they really failed? Today living a vegan lifestyle is popular. Healthy living is popular. Living in harmony with nature is a popular idea. These ideas are a direct result of hippie culture. So, did they really fail? Or have they infiltrated our society to teach us some of life's most valuable lessons? For example, that money isn't everything. That we need to make happiness and our mental well-being a priority in our lives, and not get caught up in shopping culture, consumerism, and materialism. It's no coincidence that the most intelligent among us value things other than money, power, and wealth. That smart people grow more and more removed from society as they grow older and wiser, in search for the things that our society cannot provide. Peace, love and happiness. And of course, swingers. So as long as we have smart people, the spirit of hippie culture will always be alive and well.
We asked Gabe Katz, one of the editors of the Oracle.
Look around you, nothing works. The only thing the kid is presented with is when you grow up, you can join the army, you can go to war, you can get a gig working as an engineer and become a vegetable and drive to work in your own car, in your own big metal box. It looks absurd. People in their metal boxes like this going all over from job to job, frustrated, uptight. What joy is there in life? Life is and should be ecstasy. Being alive should be a joy, and it's a drag for most people because they never had a chance to figure it out for themselves what they wanted to do. You're going to be a this. When you go to school for the right to earn, to buy more pieces of metal junk, and of not really relating to his family. Father's somebody that goes to work, and he gets shoved into school, and when he turns on, he sees, wow, there's something else.